Well, happy Tuesday morning, everybody. Pastor Steve here, and I'm really excited you've joined me for today's devotion. We are in the book of Genesis, chapter 14, continuing this journey of Abram, who would later have his name changed to Abraham. And in this chapter, and really thinking about the previous chapters as well, one of the things that jumps out at me is the many-faceted nature of this man named Abraham. I mean, think about it. He was a man of tremendous faith, a man of adventure, leaving his homeland and moving to a new place. He was a leader, a military strategist. We see that in this chapter. He was wealthy. He was good at building alliances and networking and being respected by others. He was respected by those in the land that he had moved into. He was a man of integrity. He was not perfect, but he really was a special man, a many-faceted man. And in this chapter, you read about all these kings. And, when you and I think about kings today, we think, kings of a country. But in most of history, especially prior to the Middle Ages, kings often had smaller kingdoms. You'd have a king of this city or a king of this region. So like Sodom had a king, Gomorrah had a king. So they weren't kings of areas as large as we think about today. Now some in ancient times were, like the king of Babylon or the king of Assyria, but most kings. Even in Greek, you had the city-states. You had all these cities that eventually became a country. But each city was its own little fiefdom with its own king and so on. So that's what you have happening here in chapter 14. Now, what I want to focus on is the story of Melchizedek, starting in verse 18. So let's read that together, 18 through 20. It says, Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now, to Abraham, after Abraham had won this victory and retrieved all the people who had been captured and rescued his nephew Lot and so on. So Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brings out bread and wine. It's a celebration of their victory. Now, he was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. So Melchizedek, this priest of God, as well as the king of Salem, blesses Abraham. And then at the end of verse 19, he, which is Abraham, gave him a tenth of all, a tenth of the spoils of the war. And that's just part of the story there. Now, this Melchizedek, this is all we know about him. He's mentioned in the book of Hebrews in chapter 7, and this is his story. This is it. A king and a priest of the Most High God. And one of the things I want you to see is that there were people who knew God and worshiped God other than Abram. Here's one example. The Bible is not the story of every group or every person on earth that knew and worshiped God. There were others. Melchizedek is an example of that. The Bible just doesn't tell us about everybody. In the book of Hebrews, this incident in the life of Melchizedek and Abraham is used by the author of Hebrews to illustrate how Jesus' priesthood, because Jesus is also identified as a high priest. We go through him to the Father. And his priesthood in the book of Hebrews, the argument is that his priesthood is greater than the priesthood of the Jewish people, the descendants of Aaron and Levi and so on. That Jesus' priesthood is greater, and the reason Hebrews is arguing that is because it's written to people who are believers in Jesus, their disciples, from a Jewish background, and so he's contrasting the priesthood of Jesus with the priesthood of the Jewish religion in the book of Hebrews. And he says Melchizedek is a pattern of Jesus' priesthood, and Melchizedek's priesthood was greater than the Jewish priesthood, in part because here in Genesis, Abram gives a tithe to Melchizedek. And he argues in Hebrews that within Abraham's seed was eventually all the men of Israel, all the Jewish men of Israel who would be priests of Judaism. And so here Abraham is recognizing Melchizedek, meaning that all the priests who would come forth in the centuries ahead through the seed of Abraham were in Abraham, and therefore they were paying homage to Melchizedek. They were giving a tithe to Melchizedek. And he says, in the same way, the priesthood of Jesus Christ is greater than the priesthood of Judaism. And there's more to it, but that's just a quick summation. I just wanted you to know that when you read Hebrews chapter 7 and about Melchizedek, this is where it comes from. Okay, so just be aware of that. Another thing, this is the first time tithing is mentioned in the Bible. Now, you do have Cain and Abel bringing their offerings to God. You have offerings, but this is the first time a tithe, which is 10% of one's possessions, is actually mentioned. And the biblical teaching is we tithe 10% of our earnings, of our income, as a way to say, God, we honor you, and we recognize that it all comes from you, and you own it, we don't. So it's a recognition of our submission to the lordship of Jesus in our lives and over our possessions as well. Now, a couple of quick notes. In this story, you read it that Abram did not enrich himself by keeping the booty or the spoils of his military victory. It was very common in history that when you defeated an enemy, you would take all their possessions and keep it for yourself. And that's how people would get richer, nations would get richer. When the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, they took all the utensils and gold and so on out of the temple and out of the king's palace in Jerusalem, took it back to Babylon. Abraham here did not do that. The point is that just because something is legal or that you can do it does not always mean you should do it. Legality is not always, in God's eyes, justification for action. Second thing is Lot. We talked about him a little bit yesterday, but look in chapter 14 at verse 12. They also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed. This is the kings that conquered Sodom and Gomorrah and other places, for he was living in Sodom. Now remember in chapter 13 yesterday, Abram said, Lot, let's go in different places so there's enough grass to feed our livestock and there won't be conflict. Where do you want to go? I'll let you have first choice. And Lot was attracted to that area over towards Sodom and Gomorrah, the lush valley of the Jordan River area. But he was also attracted to the city, and now he's not living out in the countryside. He's living in the city of Sodom. He's attracted to it. Abraham's building altars to worship God, and Lot's moving further and further away from God. Lot's moving toward the place of sin. And attraction matters. But attraction does not justify always behavior. Lot was attracted toward and moved toward sin, and he paid for it. Associations matter. So you and I need to be wise in what attractions do we feed in our lives and what attractions do we starve in our lives. And we need to be wise about our associations, because if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong crowd, guess what? You might just get hurt. So that's Genesis chapter 14. I'll see you tomorrow as we look at chapter 15. God bless you, everybody.